can imagine the warm sand on my toes, the squawk of seabirds, faint music floating in the air from someone's speakers. But I can't do the same with some far-off alien galaxy. After a few moments of imagining the place I want to go to, I'm just there. I go to bed in my shitty Charlestown apartment, and then I'm sunbathing in St. Lucia. I know it probably sounds like I'm just really good at lucid dreaming, but my body physically goes there. One of the first times I can clearly remember dreamwalking was when I was 7 and homesick with the flu. I was watching the Disney Channel, and as I started to fall asleep, I imagined what it would be like to go to Disney World. I pictured the big castle and the crowds and the rides. I could smell popcorn and sunscreen and heard a baby crying. The next thing I know, my Nana is shaking me awake and demanding to know how I got the ridiculously large Mickey Mouse balloon in my bedroom. I've had fun with it. Went to a lot of parties in high school I wasn't supposed to be at. I spent a whole month going to Hawaii every night. Everything was fine up until a month ago. One night I went to sleep and was picturing myself in a London park. It was a nice mild day and the light was filtering in gray through the overcast clouds. There was a group of kids playing tag in the tall grass in front of me, and I was perfectly content to do some people watching until I had to wake up for my 8 a.m. alarm. That's when I saw it for the first time. It was pretty far away, and for a second I thought I was seeing things. Past the children on the grass and lurking in the thinning tree line stood something that almost resembled a man. I could tell, even from the distance, it was tall, its shoulders hunched forward like it was trying to disguise its actual size. It had some sort of hooded cloak pulled up over its head, and I couldn't see its face. But just as I started to really focus my attention on it and try and get closer, it vanished. When I woke up the next morning, I convinced myself it was a weird prank. Some teenagers were trying to scare those kids, and I just happened to be the one who noticed it. But the rest of the day, I just had this horrible feeling, like something bad had happened. When I got home, I Googled London Park accident. I was trying to reassure myself that nothing happened, and that the search would yield nothing, but I was wrong. I was so wrong. The first news result that showed up was a picture of the exact bench I had been sitting on, except in the photo it was destroyed. The related headline read, "Drunk driver plummets off bridge and into local park. Several injuries reported. Deaths feared imminent." I slammed my laptop shut and tried to assure myself it wasn't the same park, that this was some sort of weird coincidence, and I was misremembering my dream walk from the night before. Maybe I did, and maybe this first time was a coincidence, but it hasn't stopped since then. The very next night I pictured myself on a tropical beach somewhere in the Bahamas. I felt the warm sun on my face, the tacky plastic straps of the lounge chair resting against my back. I was absent-mindedly drawing shapes in the white sand when I saw that thing again. This time it was just a little closer. It stood further down the beach from me. It was hunched over the surf, letting the salt water lap at its long arms. I shut my eyes tight and tried to will it away. I was hoping it was some kind of actual dream invading my walk. Like a nightmare was breaking through from my subconscious, but when I opened my eyes again, instead of being met with more sun and sand, I saw the stained ceiling of my bedroom. Against my better judgment, I immediately grabbed my phone and searched Bahamas, and then added recent deaths and hit enter. My heart hit the bottom of my stomach, and then promptly rocketed into my chest, causing me to heave the tropical cocktail I had been sipping on before that thing had showed up out of my stomach and onto the floor. The first related article was only a few hours old and read, "Honeymooners killed in tragic accident. Scuba gear malfunction kills newlyweds." I decided at that moment I was never going to dream walk again. I had no idea if I was somehow causing this, but I couldn't risk it. The problem is, I can't stop. I don't mean I can't stop as in I'm addicted to it. I mean my body physically starts even if I don't picture anything. I tried for a week straight. I would close my eyes and think of nothing. I would picture an endless white void. No sounds, no people, just blank emptiness. But the second I fell asleep, I was at the Grand Canyon. The next morning, the breaking news was of an elderly woman on her bucket list trip whose electric scooter malfunctioned and she went headlong over the side of the walls. The next night was the same. Even without actively trying to dream walk, I found myself in a mall outside of St. Louis. There was a small fire in an electronics store which caused panic, and in the resulting stampede, someone was crushed. It doesn't matter what I think of or do. Every night I find myself somewhere new, and that thing is getting closer and closer. I think the thing is playing with me at this point, like it can sense I'm terrified of it. I think it knows I'm scared, and it likes it that way. I think it enjoys my fear. It waits for me to almost relax into my surroundings before pouncing and sending me in flight or fight mode. It's only been flight so far. I've been able to make out more details now. It's probably about 7 feet tall, give or take a foot. What I thought was a long black coat is actually thick matted fur. I still haven't seen its face clearly, but it's pale, like it's never seen the light of day. It has what look like the beginning of horns growing on its head, and I swear they have gotten bigger the closer it gets. I've tried staying awake, but it's no use. No amount of energy drinks or Adderall seem to work. My body just shut down after a while, and I'm somewhere I don't want to be, and wondering what horrific headline will be there when I wake up. The closer the thing gets to me, the closer the places are to. I'm hiding out in my mom's place in Boston because I'm too afraid to be alone, and last night I was at a diner in New Jersey. I have no idea what this thing is. I don't know what it wants. All I know is that if I go to sleep tonight, I have no idea if I'll wake up. If you know what this thing is, if you've ever seen it, please tell me. I'm trying to stay awake for as long as I can because I can't shake the feeling that I am on borrowed time as is. God, I hope I'm alive to see the sunrise. Pardon? I responded incredulously. 200 pounds per hour, Susan repeated. Yeah, I replied. But you said I'd be babysitting a... No, I must have misheard you. Where's the child? Child? Stephen laughed. We don't have children. You heard me correctly, George. Just watch the machine for a few hours, Susan said. That's all, isn't it, Stephen? Indeed, Susan, Stephen chuckled. Honestly, this new generation... You'd think they could handle babysitting a washing machine, wouldn't you? You would, Susan laughed. Perhaps we should write it on a piece of paper for him. He probably needs to be told through the medium of TikTok, Stephen said. The pair of them laughed, and I stifled the irritated huff that was itching to emerge from my tightly compressed lips. They were insufferable, but pound 200 per hour of babysitting was a staggering offer. It would have been staggering if I'd been offered that much to care for an actual person. But a washing machine? Let them have their fun, I thought. I was certain I'd have the last laugh. And so, I bit my tongue. No, I said, smiling. I think I've got it. Good lad, Stephen said, ruffling my hair in a patronizing fashion. May I take your coat? I shrugged, but Stephen had already slipped it off my shoulders before I could respond. He disappeared upstairs, which seemed a little peculiar, given they had a coat stand by the door, but I didn't question it. We'll see you at 11 o'clock, okay? Susan asked. I nodded, waving as they left. I lifted a middle finger as soon as the door had shut behind them. I was about to make the easiest 800 pounds of my life. Maybe more if they stay out longer, I thought. Stephen and Susan Hall had always been the oddballs of the street. Nobody really knew them, and despite their insistence to the contrary, I could have sworn they had kids, Tim and Rachel. Mom and Dad seemed to think not, which is they were confused when the Halls offered me the babysitting gig over the Christmas break. When I found myself eyeballing a washing machine in their kitchen, I started to realize that my parents were probably right. There had never been a Tim or a Rachel, but I wasn't complaining about the bizarre request. As a broke university student, the thought of making eye-watering money in a single night had me salivating in seconds. As soon as the Halls popped round to make the offer, I rushed over to their house at the end of the street without another thought. Anyway, after that rude conversation with the Halls, I initially planned to not even bother babysitting the washing machine. But I was so glad I eventually peered through the oval window, because I was treated to a sight of unexpected hilarity. A mountain of miniature outfits circled the rumbling drum. There must have been hundreds of items in there, all of them too small for any human to wear. and some were far more shrunken than others. It was a mismatched collection. Of course, they're washing doll clothing, I thought, laughing aloud. Absolute nut jobs. Of course, I immediately sent pictures to my friends. "No way," Johnny replied. "Those two are so weird. I can't believe you're not babysitting actual humans." "Didn't we play with their kids when we were growing up?" Sarah asked. "That's what I said to my parents," I replied. "But they didn't think so. And Stephen and Susan said they don't have any children." "Oh, but they do," Johnny said. "Their beautiful baby washing machine." I snorted. "Also, I'm just thinking about the photos you sent," Johnny continued. "I think I recognize that teensy tiny t-shirt in the second picture. The one with the green turtle on it. See it? Oh my word, Tim wore that." "Well, a larger version of that," Sarah messaged. "Yeah, that name rings a bell," Johnny said. My heart dropped. "Wait, Tim? Okay, this is getting weird now. I was part joking about them having kids, but that's the exact name I had in my head." Before my friends could respond, the doorbell rang. The sudden ding startled me, and my phone clattered to the tiles below, screen shattering dramatically. I groaned. "Of course." I scooped up my wounded technological appendage, sighed at the screen I could no longer read, and placed the fallen soldier on the dining table. I stormed to the front of the house, ready to scowl at whoever had unwittingly caused my phone's demise. But when I flung the door open, nobody was there. Though I was certain I could hear a faint wailing sound in the wind, as if a distant scream were striving to capture my attention. With a heavy sigh, I closed the door and returned to the kitchen, frustrated that a sizable portion of the night's earnings would be going towards fixing my phone screen. I squinted at the device's splintered screen, but it was useless. I couldn't read what my friends had replied. Suddenly, my attention diverted to an unusual noise from the washing machine's innards, a sound that was hard to distinguish, though it had some sort of subconscious effect on my body, lining my skin with a wave of goosebumps and upright hairs, much like the wailing wind at the front door. It sounded like a chorus of piercing shrieks. I knelt onto the kitchen tiles, sighing as my jeans pressed into shattered pieces of my phone screen, and stared deeply into the whirlpool of minuscule clothes which filled the washing machine. The rumble of the drum, the rustling of a tire, and the whooshes of water mostly drowned out the mysterious noise. But it was there. I hadn't imagined it. A choral pang of despair. And then I saw something which filled me with a terror unlike anything I'd ever experienced. A fleshy creature, half the size of a pinky finger, slithered between two items of clothing. I yelled and immediately fell backwards, unable to pinpoint what I had seen, but entirely certain it was no insect. No animal. I hurriedly smashed every button on the washing machine, desperate to end the cycle. I'm not sure why my instinct wasn't to run. My brain wasn't functioning correctly. I waited a few minutes for the water to drain from the drum, watching the still pile of tiny outfits. My body shook violently, anticipating movement from within the clothing. But there was nothing. No fleshy monstrosity pounced out at me. And then there came the dreaded ding to signify that the door was safe to open. The drenched pile of clothes sat motionlessly, and I spent several minutes summoning the courage to rummage through it. The never-ending piercing sound was louder now. It was a muffled noise coming from the bottom of the clothes pile. I scarcely dared to look. Shrunken garments slipped through my fingers, and it was only upon closer inspection that I came to a horrifying realization. The outfits were stained with blood and some sort of indistinguishable mush. I could feel the vomit rising in my mouth, but I was, as I uncovered the final layer of clothes at the bottom of the drum, that I finally unloaded the contents of my stomach. A graveyard of flesh lay against the drum. There were hundreds of shrunken bodies, horribly disfigured, bloodied, and mushed. But the worst part was that some of the miniaturized victims were still moving. The indiscernible peach-colored things were people, and the piercing choral sound was that of their screaming. One of the less mangled people began to crawl over the smaller mound of clothes I'd created in the clearing. He was calling to me in a small, feeble voice. "Save us! Help!" he cried repeatedly. I watched in paralyzed fear, trying to decide whether it would be safe for me to reach the palm of my hand inside the drum to scoop out the few people still moving. The man who had wriggled free from the mound of bodies seemed wounded and helpless, but I was terrified of touching that horror scene. With a deep breath, I outstretched my hand, placing it palm side up on the clothes at the bottom. And as the tiny man, along with a few other survivors, clambered onto my skin, I tried to conceal the shivers that spread throughout my body. The first man continued to shout as I steadily lifted my hand closer to my ear. But I soon realized I'd misheard him the first time. "Not save us. Help. Save yourself." "What's happening?" I whispered weakly. "What? Didn't you see Grace outside?" The man screamed into my ear. My body shivered as I realized that must have been who rang the doorbell, the tiny voice I heard wailing in the wind. "It doesn't matter now! Just find your coat and get out of here!" He screeched in a minute voice. "Why do I need my coat?" I asked, gulping. "Because they'll shrink it to shrink you. I don't know how or why they do it, but it happened to all of us." I moved my hand to eye level, surveying the 6 survivors, 5 of whom were writhing on my palm. Only the main man seemed to be in any sort of fit state. Are you Tim?" I asked quietly. "What? Oh, the boy," he sighed. "No, the Halls put their children somewhere special. Never mind that. Come on, you need to find your coat." I looked at the clock on the wall. "Relax, it's 8 o'clock. They're not getting back until 11. "They never went anywhere!" the man screamed. In a near-synchronized manner, the house's lights extinguished. "Oh no," the small man whispered. "They know." "I'm getting out of here," I said, stumbling through the darkness. "If you leave, that coat goes in the next cycle and you become like us," the man warned. "Or worse." And I didn't need to question what he meant. I'd seen the pulverized bodies at the bottom of the drum. Given the inexplicable nature of the tiny human in the palm of my hand, I had reason to believe every last word he'd said. So I made my way across the darkened entryway, opened the front door, and placed the miniature figures on the paving slabs. "Go," I said. I could hear faint, pained sounds from the ground as the man said something inaudible to me before helping his injured companions. Then I stepped back into the lightless house, pulling out my shattered phone to use the flashlight. Thankfully, the screen still seemed to register my touch. Making my way up creaking stairs, the stillness of the house filled me with absolute terror, given I knew that the Halls were lurking somewhere within those 4 walls. And when I reached the upstairs landing, a door opened at the far end. A darkened bedroom beckoned. I knew it to be a trap, but I had no choice, according to the small man I had saved. Not that I could trust him either. "Stephen, Sarah?" I called. "I just want my coat. Then I'll go." I stepped into a large, lightless children's room. There were 2 single beds and, most horrifyingly, a doll on each. Dolls that looked exactly like the 2 children I was completely certain I'd never imagined at all. Tim and Rachel. But they weren't dolls, and they weren't alive. They seemed to have been shrunken and stuffed. I threw up on the floor, and the light in the house suddenly returned as Stephen and Susan entered the room through a side door. "People are so weak these days," Stephen's voice growled. "This generation sickens me." Susan sniffled. "But not our children. They were pure," I cried. "Why are you doing this to people?" "Why?" Stephen frowned, frothing at the lips and brandishing my coat in his tight grip. "To save our children, you ignorant fool. Your life will finally mean something. And seeing as you couldn't even wait for the next washing cycle, I guess we should head downstairs and start it now." You're insane! Save them! Your children are dead! Look at what you've done to them!" I cried, gesturing at the doll-sized, pale-faced corpses in the beds. Susan shrieked. "Quiet, you foul thing! We didn't kill them. This was the only way to save them." "Save your energy, honey," Stephen said, placing a hand on his wife's shoulder. "It's his turn now." And there's no running for him or his escaped friends. We'll catch them. We always do. Heart-pounding, an idea came to me. An idea so horrific that I didn't want to believe it had stemmed from my own brain. I stepped backwards and slammed the bedroom door closed. Then I turned on my heel and ran to the top of the stairs, ignoring the cackling sounds behind me. I scurried down the stairs, 2 at a time, and beelined for the coat stand by the door, scooping up 2 coats, one for Stephen and one for Susan. Hearing footsteps slowly plodding across the upstairs landing, I darted to the kitchen, realizing I had mere moments before I was caught. I threw the coats into the washing machine, ignoring the blood and guts within, and shut the door. "It's useless, George," Stephen shouted, heading down the stairs. "You won't find any weapons in this house, but you can run. Go for it." I pressed the start button, and in a stroke of genius, hammered the plastic handle off the door, preventing it from being opened. Stephen suddenly emerged in the kitchen doorway, coat in hand and frown on his face. "What are you?" He stopped mid-sentence and dropped the coat to the floor. "No! Susan!" I thought I might have to fight them off, allowing the cycle enough time to work its magic. But the horror commenced as soon as their coats began twirling in the running washing machine. As Stephen spun around in the doorway, his limbs began to crumple inwards, shrinking in a matter of seconds. He screamed in excruciating pain, as did Susan, who was still walking down the stairs. Parts of his skin tore and bled, as had been the case for most of the victims in the machine, and there sounded a series of thuds from the staircase. Stephen, mostly crippled and reduced to half of his size, ran out into the entryway, and I followed him. "No, Susan! Susan!" he cried, cradling his shrinking wife, who had tumbled to the floorboards and cracked her head open. "What have you done? You monster!" Stephen dropped his wife and turned his attention to me, charging with a furious glint in his eyes. I watched with a mixture of relief and horror as the man lunged forwards, shrinking as he went, and fell at my feet as a shriveled, pinky-sized, lifeless husk, wearing blood and guts on the outside of his corpse. I slumped to the floor of the entryway, eyeing the miniature corpses of the halls, making sure they were truly dead. And then, after an unknown period of time, I hazily walked into the kitchen, poured a bottle of vodka across the dining table, and set it ablaze with a lighter. The fire spread quickly. As I was walking towards the open front door, I noticed Stephen's wallet on a dresser. There was 80 pounds inside. Not quite enough for a new phone screen, and certainly not enough compensation for the horror I endured. But it sufficed. I wasn't willing to spend a moment longer in that house. At first, it seemed to be just the adults, and it made sense. With the recession and all, people were working longer and harder than ever. But then, every night on the news, a story would run about how more and more people were slipping into coma-like states, going into deep sleep and never waking up. World governments rushed to find the source of this epidemic. All virus and disease control studies came back negative. Strict extended holiday policies were put into place across all businesses, and work and school hours were reduced. All food and even tap water was now even enriched with caffeine in a last-ditch attempt to slow down whatever was happening. Of course, there were conspiracy theorists who decided to consume only baby food, which was excluded from the caffeine supplementation. They believed it to be all an elaborate ruse from the government for population control. There were stories of people going into a deep sleep, and their family would try to visit them in hospital but being unable to find them. But on the news, these theories were often factually debunked. Hospitals filled to the brink with deep sleep patients. They began repurposing multi-story car parks to fit beds instead of cars. And slowly but surely, without reason, it seemed that everyone and everything was susceptible. It wasn't uncommon to now see birds fall out of the sky, or even sleeping beside cats and dogs on the sidewalk. It wasn't long before driving and commandeering all vehicles was banned. Too many cases of people falling asleep at the wheel, or worse, pilots falling asleep at the wheel of domestic flights. Trains continued for a while, but also saw a ban. This led to a global lockdown of sorts. You wanted to travel to other cities. Walk or cycle. Bicycles were manufactured and sold in a minute. Police used electric ones to patrol the streets, and for normal people, our main mode of transport was push bikes. Stories were circulating of people cycling to countries to visit a family member, only to find them on their couch or in their bed in a deep sleep. It's crazy how quickly humans adjust to new realities. All of a sudden, all of this just became the norm. I come from a rather unique family. My father met my mom at 4 a.m. He was a clerk at a gas station, and she was driving around aimlessly, playing music as she couldn't sleep when she needed gas. They both hit it off, and it's fair to say that both are pretty hardcore insomniacs, even to this day. Needless to say, this trait somehow passed on to me. I joke that the three of us are like a family of cats, only taking these little naps at random times, yet being able to operate like the 7, 8-hour sleepers. Maybe we were lucky, but we'd never fall into those deep sleeps. My parents were nervous every time I'd put my head down on a pillow, yet deeply relieved when I'd get up, and often I'd surprisingly feel refreshed, almost like I was sleeping better than ever. I was wondering how that could be in such troubling and uncertain times. Why now am I getting the best rest of my life? My parents echoed similar remarks about their restful naps when a theory popped into my head. What if we have hit a point of evolution where it is imperative that we adapt to napping as our main method of sleep? I exclaimed to my dad, whilst I sat on the floor watching the nightly news on TV. Don't be ridiculous, my father said in a conclusive tone. He was a kind and loving dad, but he had a stern side around certain subjects, and for some reason, sleep was one of them. I've always been super curious about what they are calling the deep sleep epidemic. I would say most people have it at the top of their lists of concerns. My mom and dad were different, though. Their problems seemed to be primarily focused on what was now considered rather trivial, like mortgages and old world stuff. They only seemed concerned with the deep sleep when it came to me. We lived in a big house, and to my friend's disbelief, I had never met any extended family of any sort. From what I understood, both my mom and dad's side had disagreed with my parents, forming such a young infatuation in marriage. Rather extreme, I believe, as they were 19 and 20 at the time and old enough to make their own decisions. When I turned 18, I was presented with some very surprising news that my mom couldn't give birth, so they adopted me very young. I have no memory of my time before my parents' care or of an orphanage. My school therapist told me this can be a common response to instability. When you are very young, she labeled it dissociation. In the old world, I could always feel a layer of isolation around me and my family. We lived in a big house with no pets and rarely any visitors. I went to a private school, and my classes consisted of 3. 4 students. 5 students were considered a packed class. You can imagine my surprise at seeing school depicted on the TV. It was ludicrous to see so many people crammed into such a space. It didn't make sense to me. My father liked to keep things private in regards to his life. He told me he got a lucky break after his time in the gas station, and following meeting my mom, this landed him into a completely new life with more money than he could ever imagine. This lucky break was a job that he'd go to from 2 a.m. to 4 p.m. He was out and gone and back, not a fraction late ever at 4:10 p.m. This meant that his workplace must have been close, and his work very routine. Throughout the years, I always asked if there was a bring your kid to work day, as I'd seen this concept a lot on TV. He'd laugh and say it doesn't really exist yet. I've been on the internet once, and I did Googled it, and I know it does. We got the highest speed internet installed years ago, but it had to be taken out as I was told it was interfering with a local advanced electric power transmission that was apparently utilizing every possible frequency and signal. They installed a much weaker internet, and it's painstaking to use. I'd go bored having read my library of books thrice over, and my parents would bring me more for my collection, or I'd rent some from my private school library. The librarian has been in a deep sleep for 6 weeks, however, so the library is only allowed to be used when one of our teachers are present. I had a mundane dream imagining what this advanced electric power transmission tower looks like and climbing over layers of big walls to see it. I woke up from a small nap, only 15 minutes long, and I was hit with a wave of euphoria. It was almost like being on some kind of drug or happily drunk. I let out a random laugh and recalled a book I read about dreams and how REM sleep typically commences hours into the sleeping state. I heard some faint, joyous jazz music coming from down the stairs in the living room, so I walked down the winding stairs as the music got louder. The warm lights of the living room saturated the darkness of the hallway in a rather mystical way. I peered around the corner to see my mom and dad smile from ear to ear in an energetic and almost childlike dance. They looked to be having the time of their lives, and this subsequently made me happy, but when they noticed my presence, they seemed to calm themselves down and attempt to jump back to a normal spirit. No, I exclaimed. Sorry to interrupt, I'm glad you guys are having a good time. You must be hungry, dear. My mom brushed her dress down and resumed normalcy. No, I feel bad for stopping your dance, I laughed. I was happy that everyone was in such a good mood tonight. My dad let out a big burst of laughter. He couldn't help but find the whole situation hilarious. I could tell he was in an incredible mood. We are all in such a great mood tonight. We should do something, I exclaimed. It only gets better, my dad blurted out. From the corner of my eye, I observed my mum, albeit distantly in the kitchen, temporarily snap out of her elated mood to give my dad a glance that he said something he shouldn't have. My dad doesn't catch it as his laughter has brought him to putting his hands on his knees and looking at the floor. I can see that my mom has remained in her elated mood, yet she looks a little more on edge. Everything okay, Mum? She looks at me and I can tell in her eyes that she's slightly disconcerted, although her wide grin tries to tell me otherwise. Of course, darling. I know my mom well enough to see in this millisecond that she is scamming her brain for something to say. Oh, we should do something tonight. That would be fabulous. She found it. At this point, my dad is rolling on the floor. It's like he has taken a super drug and is in a state of absolute bliss and transcendent euphoria. Something doesn't quite feel right about my parents' lack of awareness now growing around their contrasting elation. My dad's happiness seems genuine, whereas my mom's appears to now be put on like a mask of sorts. Oh, there is something else. My eyes go back to my mom. Your school called today, and unfortunately, all of the staff have fallen into a deep sleep. Classes are canceled for the foreseeable future. I'm stunned by the news and zapped into this existential dread. Once my mom sees this, she immediately mirrors me. A veil had fallen, a perception of my reality, and my whole life seemed to somehow fall. I was now suspicious of my parents. I look to my father, and he's still hysterically happy until we catch each other's eyes, and he springs up in full energy to his feet and also meets me with an artificial empathic glance. I feel fear in my own home, with my own mother and father. This is heavy news. You should go get some rest, son. My fight, flight, or freeze had chosen to freeze, but I managed to give a single nod before heading back up the winding stairs. I heard the jazz music stop, but from the very top, I swear I could hear the shuffling of feet on the wooden floors before it went silent again. I arrived back to my room and threw myself back onto my bed. A rapid knock on my door and my heart began to race. My mom enters with a big decorative tray. I've brought your favorite food, sweet potato fries, she says in an overly enthusiastic tone. I work up the courage to ask, Mom, if my teachers have gone into a deep sleep, why were you and Dad so happy and dancing? My heartbeat begins to speed a bit as I get the question out. She scoffs. Son, life goes on. If you get hung up on every little tragedy, then you will never live. Besides, me and your father won't have to pay the overpriced tuition anymore, and you can be homeschooled. We found a tutor already. My mom continues what feels like a seemingly well-rehearsed response when my father walks in, a completely different man than what I had seen downstairs. He appears almost mournful, but it's almost like he's really trying to hold himself back from grinning, like a child at a funeral who doesn't understand the gravity or context of the situation. But these were teachers I really loved, and Mrs. Jones, the librarian. They really cared about us students, I interrupted. My dad points to the big clock in my room that reads 1 a.m. Well, look at the time I have work in an hour. He softly grabs my mom on her shoulders and ushers her to go to bed with him. We are really sorry for this news, son. and we understand how much your teachers mean to you. But now we must be getting to bed as I have work in an hour." My mom looks back on their way out, pointing to the sweet potato fries. "Enjoy your late supper. Your tutor will be coming in the morning." They close the door, and I hear them close the door to their room down the hall, too. I start to question what I've seen and felt this evening. Could the euphoria I woke up with caused me to be almost delirious? Am I imagining it all? What did my dream mean, and just maybe it wasn't so mundane? In fear of waking my parents, I very quietly opened and closed my door. I needed some cold water to the face as I headed to the big bathroom that was halfway down the hall before I was met with a faint sound that was unmistakably like bouncing on the bed. I tiptoe to just outside my parents' door, and I hear quietened laughter. It sounds like they are having the time of their lives, bouncing on the bed like children. This confirmed my unease. I knew from that moment I was going to my dad's work. I knew I had to learn more about these people I called my parents. I continued my tiptoeing down the winding stairs until I was swallowed into the darkness of the hallway. I hid behind a pullover curtain for what felt like half an hour before I was met with the sound of my dad ecstatically hopping down the stairs. He let out a childlike "wee" as he reached the bottom and jumped what sounded like 6 steps. His feet hit the floor and he marched in a military-like trance to the door. My parents never drank alcohol. They advocated against all substances, and I knew they wouldn't take anything knowingly. So what if they had somehow been drugged? This is a big possibility. Maybe the global scare is hitting them too, and this is their attempt to medicate the anxiety away. If so, my dad shouldn't be going to work anyway, so I must follow him. I rationalized my decision as best as I could, knowing a big part of me was also yearning to grow closer to my father and the strange newfound feelings of wanting to really protect him. He brushes past the curtain I am hiding behind and opens up the front door before swiftly closing it behind him. I peer out the small pattern window of the door, and to my disbelief, I see a luxurious black car parked with the engine running waiting on my dad, who is now skipping towards the back seat. He opens the door and climbs in. I see a red suede interior, but I can't make out who is driving due to the deeply tinted windows. All cars are banned from use, so how on earth could my father be picked up in one? Just how illegal was his work? Many thoughts seemed to flood my mind. I used to go out to my back garden on the hill every night for hours and just look into the stars. I'd get lost in them. I would imagine dancing between them and feeling like I am astral, projecting to and fro each one, narrowly dodging them. Some nights these gray clouds just seemed to drift in and block everything. I would patiently wait for them to reveal some stars, almost like they presented me with some kind of hope. I would try my best to rendezvous with them every night, even better if the moon was out. Tonight it appeared starless. The car left in no time between my dad getting in and taking off down our driveway and through our gate. It must have been the adrenaline that fueled me to hop on my bike and race down the driveway before our automatic gates closed, but I was tailing the black car from a distance, just seeing the very back of it at every turn it took down the forested back roads. I almost lost it due to how efficient the driver was. I hauled on both brakes as I saw the red brake lights of the car through the tree-lined dot. It was stopping. I hop off my bike and peer around the thick tree at the corner of the road. We were at the entrance of the Advanced Electric Power Transmission Tower, ... It was the site from my dream. I watched as the black car gained entry through layers upon layers of walls. I observed men dressed in army fatigues with heavy weaponry. So this is where my dad worked. There was no way I could breach it. A crazy idea came to mind. I knew my dad had a special uniform he'd wear that was always zipped in a black cover and hung in his wardrobe. He told me to never touch or open it, and he must have had about 7 uniforms at a given time, one for each day of the week, I'd assume. Unlike in my dream, I understood that these walls with guards are completely unscalable. Impersonating an employee such as my father is the only way I will be able to gain entry. It was a crazy idea, but what else could I do? As I turn to head home, I see headlights of what appears to be another car coming down the road. This time my fight or flight kicks in for the better, and I rapidly grab my bike and throw it into the bushes that line the forest before jumping into them myself. I land on a bush of thorns and do my best to silence my shriek of pain, but it doesn't work. An identical car to the one my dad was picked up in was parked directly on the road in front of me. It seems to hover for a moment, and it becomes clear that I have been spotted. The driver door flings open, and what appears to be a tall, slender figure extends out, their face blacked out by what either appears to be a thin balaclava, or worse, its skin. I get up and trip in the thorns as I try to run back into the shroud of the forest, but its arms seamlessly extend and entrap me like a spider suspending a fly. Terrified, time froze as I was held and suspended 5 feet from the ground. A human emerges from the back seat of the car with what appears to be some kind of toolkit. He is wearing the same uniform that my dad left in today, and he also bolsters a large grin as he skips towards me. He jumps right over my bike and the thorns. He places the toolkit just where my feet were before the arms of the driver suspended me. He opens the toolkit and begins tying my feet together with this thick wire that appears to be alive. It spirals up and around my legs before tying my hands together and warping to close around my head and mouth. ... It prevents me from screaming out loud, and all I see and hear is black. I must have passed out from the panic as I could no longer feel the extended arms of the driver. I'm lying down and I can feel a pillow on the back of my head. I feel like I'm in a sensory deprivation tank with moments piercing in of where I really am. This has all been an elaborate lucid dream nightmare, surely. I just can't open my eyes. It must be sleep paralysis. I scream, "Wake up! Wake up!" But my screams are still being silenced, and it's like they're echoing into some deep cavern of darkness you throw a stone into with sound bouncing off the walls. Something relieves itself from covering my eyes, and I'm met with a blurred vision as I squint deeply at the new incoming light. It's faint and has a dull crimson overlay. I blink a lot, and with every blink, my vision becomes slightly more clear. I'm in a circular pod that has just enough room to contain a bed, not tall enough for me to stand, but just enough for me to be able to sit up. I wish I never sat up. I wish I was put into a deep sleep, because what I saw was far worse than any nightmare. I was in a profoundly big underground room with connecting tubes to the top of every sleeping pod, all leading towards this faceless, humongous organism of warping and animated flesh that was constantly animatedly moving and growing, feeding off the deep sleepers. Many tubes led up and out of the room. You could see for miles and miles until the end of the human side of these sleeper pods. It was the most startling sight anyone could ever see. One tube didn't lead from a sleeper pod, but it led to a very enlarged pod that contained computers and self-operating machinery that was drawing what appeared to be levels going up. A further tube was dispensing pills into another large pod that fell onto a conveyor belt, where I saw men with my father's uniform collect and package them into typical household products, such as water bottle packs, dinner packs, coffee grounds, and even dishwasher soap. I noticed that from these hundreds of thousands of pods of sleepers, I was the only one sitting up. I looked back at the big pod and saw a man looking at me through binoculars. I hear a sound and smell a faint gas enter the pod. I close my eyes for another little nap,